Some men are shaped by opportunity, some by violence, and some, like Elgin Johnson, are shaped by the system built to stop them. He entered the justice system at 16 and never left it behind. Every arrest, every transfer, every courtroom glare taught him a lesson the courts never intended him to learn. How the machinery worked, where its seams were weakest, and how a determined mind could slip through them again and again. He moved through jails the way other men moved through cities, quietly, quickly, learning the structure of confinement the way a craftsman learns grain and steel. Probation didn't reform him. Prison didn't humble him. Alcatraz didn't break him. It refined him. Elgin Johnson's path toward federal pursuit began long before his name appeared in investigative reports or parole documents. Born on August 21, 1919, in Lynn Grove, Iowa, he emerged from a large family with little recorded about his earliest years. Only the broader movements of a boy raised across the northwestern United States. Whatever stability existed in his youth dissolved by the time he reached 16. That year marked the point at which he stepped into the criminal justice system for the first time. Arrested for larceny in Rapid City, South Dakota, he received probation, but the court's leniency did not redirect him. Within months, he crossed state lines and accumulated new charges, moving from one jurisdiction to another, with a pace that suggested both rootlessness and intent. By early 1936, he was confined in New Mexico for breaking and entering. He remained there for nearly a year before his release. Freedom lasted only briefly. In March 1937, he appeared in custody again, this time in Salt Lake City, Utah, under an alias. Investigators logging his arrest noted the pattern forming behind each case file: a teenager circulating through western states, adopting false names, and testing the criminal process almost as quickly as it attempted to contain him. When Los Angeles authorities located him in 1938 on burglary charges and arranged his return to Wyoming, the cycle tightened. He served close to 2 years before stepping back into public life in August 1940. Although still young, he had already built a record that marked him as a repeat offender, with experience in courts, jails, and the spaces between them. The following month pushed him into far more serious territory. On September 17, 1940, a lone gunman robbed the Hollywood branch of the Citizens National Trust and Savings Bank, triggering an investigation that expanded rapidly when 3 additional banks in Los Angeles were struck on the same day. While police and federal agents searched for suspects, Johnson, unnoticed at first, left the city and resurfaced in Sioux City, Iowa, where he was arrested after a department store robbery. Among his possessions, investigators found a newspaper detailing the Los Angeles crimes. Witnesses later identified him, and financial tracing connected him to purchases that matched the timing of the robberies. When federal agents confronted him, he admitted involvement in 2 of the cases. The courts moved quickly. In December 1940, he received 2 concurrent 15-year federal sentences and was transferred to McNeil Island Penitentiary to begin serving them. Confinement did little to restrain his impulses. His disciplinary record led to a transfer to Leavenworth, where he attempted escape alongside 2 other inmates and assaulted prison guards. A Kansas court convicted him in 1944 of assault with intent to kill a federal officer, adding 4 years to his sentence and prompting officials to recommend his removal to the nation's most controlled environment. On June 10, 1944, he arrived at Alcatraz. The prison's rigid structure, long-term isolation, and population of hardened offenders formed the backdrop against which he spent the next 9 years. By the time he left the island in 1953, under conditional release, he carried with him an accumulated resentment shaped by nearly 2 decades of confinement, a history of escalating violence, and a trajectory that would soon collide with federal agents in one final confrontation. By the mid-1930s, the United States was still wrestling with the strain of the Great Depression, and many young men drifted between small towns and scattered job prospects. Elgin Johnson moved among them, but his direction diverged sharply once he began treating crime as both opportunity and identity. His first recorded offense in November 1935 placed him in Rapid City, South Dakota, where local authorities detained him for larceny. At 16, he was processed as a young offender, and the court's decision to issue probation showed the system's assumption that correction could still reach him. Instead, the release functioned as a brief intermission, Johnson left court supervision with no intention of stopping his momentum, and the ease with which he shifted into new acts of theft marked the beginning of a cycle that would define the next 2 decades of his life. 3 months later, he appeared in Santa Fe, New Mexico, facing new charges for breaking and entering. The offense carried a more substantial penalty, and he entered confinement for a term ranging from 18 months to 2 years. Although he served only 11 months, the experience exposed him further to hardened offenders and institutional routines that would become familiar to him. When he walked out of the facility, he did so without outward hesitation, immediately stepping back into the itinerant movement that had already characterized his behavior. The states changed, but his pattern did not. Arrest reports from March 1937 show him in Salt Lake City under the alias Eric Vernon Jefferson, detained for car prowling. Officers processing him noted his age, his inconsistent personal history, and his growing list of offenses across multiple jurisdictions. Johnson's movements resembled a deliberate search for new opportunities rather than attempts to evade responsibility. He returned repeatedly to the same environments: back alleys, cheap hotels, train yards, where stolen goods and quick money circulated with minimal oversight. His familiarity with those margins increased with each arrest, and by 19, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who viewed the criminal system not as a deterrent, but as a predictable set of stages to navigate. When Los Angeles authorities apprehended him in August 1938 for burglary and extradited him to Wyoming, where the crime had taken place, the formal sentence of 2 to 3 years confirmed that his offenses were no longer regarded as juvenile missteps. He served nearly the full term, leaving custody in August 1940. The months between his release and his next major crime revealed how little distance existed between incarceration and reoffending. Johnson returned to society with no visible change in conduct. He had no established trade, no lasting ties to any location, and no intention of securing work through conventional means. His interactions with law enforcement had produced neither caution nor reform, and the institutional boundaries he had encountered so far had only reinforced his ability to navigate them. The stage was set for an escalation that would move beyond petty theft and burglary. Within weeks, he would shift into armed robbery, pushing his criminal career into a new category of federal interest and initiating the long pursuit that would eventually define him as a fugitive across multiple states. When Johnson walked out of confinement in August 1940, he carried the weight of multiple convictions, but none of the restraint expected from years spent inside correctional systems. His release placed him back into a world he had repeatedly rejected, one that offered him neither support nor structure, and for which he had developed an ingrained indifference. The pattern established over the previous 5 years, offense, arrest, release, repetition, remained intact. Yet the next phase of his life would demonstrate how quickly he was willing to escalate. He had served nearly 2 full years for burglary, and the transition from a controlled cell block to the open streets did not lead to reflection or hesitation. Instead, he returned to Los Angeles and immediately slipped into the same environments that had shaped his earlier behavior. The months that followed revealed the extent to which confinement had failed to disrupt his momentum. Johnson's time in Wyoming had aged him, but not altered the core outlook that directed his choices. He moved through Los Angeles with the detached confidence of someone who believed he understood the risks and limits imposed by law enforcement. His knowledge of the city's streets, the flow of daily business, and the vulnerabilities of retail establishments gave him the foundation for a new level of crime. By September 1940, he had positioned himself near the Hollywood branch of the Citizens National Trust and Savings Bank. The sequence of events that unfolded on September 17 reflected planning rather than improvisation. He entered the bank during routine hours, interacted with a teller to create a sense of normalcy, and then shifted his posture into an armed robbery that unfolded within minutes. Investigators later noted the precision with which he executed the theft, moving quickly once the weapon appeared and exiting before employees could grasp the full event. That same day, 3 additional banks in Los Angeles were robbed by separate offenders, creating a surge of confusion that initially concealed Johnson's involvement. Law enforcement agencies undertook parallel investigations, comparing methods and suspect profiles while attempting to determine whether the crimes were connected. Johnson did not remain in the city long enough for detectives to reach him. He left shortly after the robbery, traveling across states until he surfaced more than 1,000 miles away. In Sioux City, Iowa, he committed another robbery at a department store, revealing both his continued dependence on theft and his disregard for the heightened consequences of his recent offense. His arrest there marked the point at which investigators began forming the connections that would eventually tie him back to the Los Angeles bank crime. When authorities searched his belongings, they found a newspaper account describing the Los Angeles robberies. Financial records showed that immediately after September 17, he had purchased a 1939 Mercury sedan, new tires, and a car radio, paying in cash consistent with the stolen amount. Witnesses in California identified him as the man who stood at their counters that afternoon. The pieces accumulated quickly, and Johnson's earlier attempts to distance himself from the city proved ineffective. Within weeks, he faced federal charges that sharply surpassed those of his earlier record. His repeated returns to crime had finally placed him in the category of offenders targeted by federal law enforcement, and the cycle of falls that defined his early years now pushed him toward the most consequential period of his life. The investigation into the Los Angeles robberies began with uncertainty. 4 banks had been struck on the same day, each by a lone offender, each within a narrow time frame that left detectives sorting through overlapping witness accounts and scattered clues. The Hollywood branch robbery stood out for its clear sequence. A young man entering the bank under ordinary pretenses, requesting change, waiting for the exchange of bills, and then shifting abruptly into armed theft. The tactic reflected calculation. The maneuver allowed him to stand directly at the counter, minimize suspicion, and ensure proximity to cash drawers before revealing the weapon. After collecting the money, he fled quickly enough to avoid immediate pursuit. Bank employees provided a general description, but the volume of crimes that day diluted early efforts to isolate him. As federal agents joined the inquiry, they worked to separate the individual robberies rather than assume a coordinated pattern. The process required them to compare the method, timing, and movement of each suspect. In the Hollywood case, the thief's actions suggested a lone operator rather than a synchronized group. Still, without a known suspect, investigators focused on neighborhood canvassing, vehicle sightings, and newly reported expenditures in surrounding districts. None of those leads pointed directly to Johnson in the initial days. He had left California almost immediately after the crime, moving through the Midwest with the confidence of someone who believed distance could dilute suspicion. His arrest in Sioux City for the unrelated department store robbery became the turning point. The discovery of the newspaper clipping in his belongings provided investigators with their first link between him and the events in Los Angeles. That detail, combined with the large cash expenditures on the Mercury sedan and accessories purchased soon after the bank crimes, created a trail that matched the timeline too precisely to ignore. When federal agents compared witness descriptions from Los Angeles with Johnson's newly acquired photograph, the similarities strengthened the case. Multiple tellers tentatively identified him, and financial tracing confirmed that the money he spent aligned with the amount taken from the Hollywood branch. The investigation expanded as federal agents assessed his movements between states. His rapid departure from California, followed by immediate criminal activity in Iowa, reflected a pattern consistent with offenders who relied on mobility to avoid detection. The ability to enter, strike, and leave before local agencies could coordinate tracking had worked in his favor, but the involvement of the FBI changed the dynamic. Once his identity surfaced in the Des Moines office's communication, the Los Angeles Field Division moved quickly to consolidate evidence and prepare charges. Confronted with the mounting case against him, Johnson admitted involvement in the Los Angeles crimes, though he initially claimed responsibility for all 4 robberies committed that day. Subsequent investigation disproved 2 of those admissions, highlighting his willingness to attach himself even to crimes he had not committed. His motivation was interpreted as an attempt to inflate his standing within criminal circles, rather than a gesture of cooperation. By late November, federal prosecutors secured an indictment for 2 counts of bank robbery. On December 23, 1940, he received 2 concurrent 15-year sentences. The Los Angeles robberies marked the end of his freedom for years to come and solidified his transition from a transient thief to a federal inmate whose escalating behavior would lead him toward harsher institutions and deeper resentment. Once the federal sentences were issued in December 1940, Johnson entered a new tier of confinement that separated him from the state-level institutions he had previously cycled through. He was transported to the United States Penitentiary on McNeil Island, a facility built for long-term federal offenders whose crimes carried weight beyond regional jurisdictions. The transfer placed him under stricter supervision and surrounded him with inmates whose backgrounds paralleled his own in repetition, escalation, and disregard for correctional structure. Prison officials documented him as a young but seasoned offender, someone familiar with the procedures of intake and classification, and someone who showed no outward signs of hesitation about his new environment. He adapted quickly, following institutional routines while maintaining the distance that often defined inmates unwilling to acknowledge the prospect of rehabilitation. During his early months at McNeil Island, Johnson's behavior fluctuated between periods of compliance and episodes of tension that drew the attention of staff. His record revealed a man who had learned to adjust just enough to avoid immediate penalties while resisting any engagement that might indicate genuine reform. His work assignments placed him in contact with other inmates who shared histories of interstate crime. And the confined culture of the penitentiary reinforced patterns he had carried with him for years. Reports from correctional officers described him as observant and controlled, with a capacity for patience that contrasted sharply with the impulsive nature of his crimes. Yet beneath that exterior, he carried a growing frustration with the institutions that had shaped his adulthood. The turning point came when he was transferred to Leavenworth, prompted not by improvement, but by disciplinary considerations. The move placed him in one of the most heavily fortified federal institutions of the era, a place known for housing high-risk offenders and those whose conduct required greater oversight. Leavenworth's structure imposed a level of rigidity that Johnson resisted. His adjustment deteriorated rapidly as he navigated its cell blocks, daily counts, and strict routines. His involvement in an attempted escape with two other inmates demonstrated both his unwillingness to accept his sentence and his readiness to engage in violence to circumvent it. During the attempt, he and his accomplices assaulted guards, escalating the confrontation beyond a simple breakout attempt and into an act that carried significant legal consequences. A federal jury in Kansas found him guilty of assault with intent to kill a federal officer in April 1944. The conviction added 4 years to his sentence, but the more critical outcome was the recommendation that he be transferred to Alcatraz. The advice came from prison officials who recognized that Johnson's combination of repeated offenses, escape attempts, and violent behavior demanded the highest level of containment the federal system could provide. Preparations for the transfer were completed in early June. On June 10, 1944, Johnson arrived at the Island Penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, joining a population composed of the nation's most difficult and unmanageable inmates. His entry into Alcatraz marked a shift that even he could not have fully anticipated. The facility's strict regimen, isolation, and absence of tolerance for disruptive conduct would shape the next 9 years of his life, deepening the internal hostility he already carried. Federal justice had reached its firmest boundary, and Johnson's confinement there would harden the outlook that would ultimately define his actions once he left the island behind. Leavenworth had already strained Johnson's capacity to function within institutional limits, but his attempted escape revealed the depth of his resistance to confinement. The plan, carried out with 2 other inmates, depended on timing, force, and the element of surprise. Their attempt was neither impulsive nor chaotic. It reflected a calculated decision shaped by months of observation inside the prison's rigid framework. When the opportunity appeared, Johnson confronted guards with the same aggression that had characterized his earlier crimes, turning a failed breakout into a violent assault. The confrontation left no doubt about his intentions, and the severity of the act shifted his status within the federal system. Authorities treated the incident not as desperation, but as confirmation that he belonged among the most unmanageable offenders in federal custody. The subsequent conviction for assault with intent to kill a federal officer placed an additional 4 years onto the sentences he was already serving. More telling than the added time was the assessment provided by prison officials, who warned that Johnson's combination of persistence, violence, and institutional familiarity required the strictest environment available. Their report recommended immediate transfer to the federal penitentiary at Alcatraz, the facility reserved for inmates whose records included escape attempts, repeated offenses, and acts of extreme resistance. The recommendation carried significant weight. Within weeks of the jury's decision, federal authorities finalized the paperwork, organized the transport chain, and placed Johnson under the classification reserved for maximum security offenders. On June 10, 1944, he arrived on Alcatraz Island. The reception process followed strict procedure: identification, medical examination, assignment of inmate number, and introduction to a system designed to enforce order with precision. The layout of the prison, the unbroken lines of steel bars, and the structure of daily routines left no room for improvisation. Cells were entered and exited according to fixed schedules. Movement occurred only under supervision. Silence and discipline were not suggestions, but mandatory components of survival within the institution. Johnson confronted a world unlike any he had known, one where his earlier adaptability and experience with confinement offered no advantage. Inside Alcatraz, his history preceded him. Guards understood his record, noted his escape attempt, and monitored him accordingly. His interactions with other inmates occurred under constant restrictions, limiting the alliances that had facilitated his earlier misconduct. The environment forced him into a controlled rhythm that he could not easily challenge. Over time, the rigidity of the island's operations produced an internal transformation that shaped his later behavior. He observed the patterns of the population around him: hardened offenders who maintained their distance, men who carried grievances against law enforcement, and others who disguised hostility behind quiet compliance. Johnson absorbed these influences while developing his own sense of resentment toward the system. The years accumulated with slow uniformity. His behavior showed no outward instability, but the environment hardened the convictions he already possessed. Reports from Alcatraz personnel described him as steady and contained, yet internally volatile. He gravitated toward religious instruction, a behavior viewed with interest but treated cautiously by chaplains familiar with inmates who sought meaning through the isolation of the island. Johnson studied doctrines, attended services, and engaged in correspondence courses, presenting himself as someone seeking transformation. Whether the effort reflected genuine introspection or a shelter from monotony remained unclear. What was evident was that the long-term discipline of Alcatraz intensified his sense of grievance. When he was eventually granted conditional release in 1953, he left the island not reformed, but more deeply committed to the hostility that would direct the final phase of his life. Alcatraz imposed a structure that left no room for negotiation. Johnson entered a world regulated by fixed schedules, unbroken surveillance, and an isolation designed to suppress defiance. The inmates around him formed a unique population: men with extensive criminal histories, men whose attempts to escape other federal institutions had forced the system to tighten its grip, and men who viewed confinement not as a deterrent, but as a continuous struggle for dominance, control, or survival. Johnson fit squarely within that group. His arrival marked him as another offender, whose prolonged resistance to authority required a setting engineered for absolute discipline. Inside those walls, the rhythms of daily life operated with a precision that eliminated the unpredictability he once used to his advantage. In this environment, Johnson adopted a careful posture. His record followed him through every interaction, prompting officers to observe him with an attention normally reserved for inmates who had demonstrated a willingness to attack guards or undermine operations. Yet, he did not challenge the system in overt ways. He moved through the routines with calculated restraint, attending work assignments, meals, and counts, without creating disruptions. The behavior suggested an adaptability that he had displayed in earlier institutions. But beneath the surface, the years on the island intensified a sense of resentment that had already taken shape long before his arrival. Alcatraz did not break him, but it hardened perspectives that would later influence every decision he made once he returned to civilian life. Among the few outlets available to him, Johnson turned toward the chapel and the prison's religious programs. Chaplains noted his steady attendance, his engagement with instruction, and his consistent requests for deeper involvement. He pursued religious correspondence courses through a Midwestern university, completing lessons with notable speed and demonstrating a detailed understanding of the material. To outside observers, this interest appeared to mark a shift, a possible sign that he was searching for direction inside the rigid confines of the island. The chaplain supervising him treated the effort seriously, but cautiously, having seen similar patterns among inmates seeking meaning or relief through structured spiritual study. Over time, Johnson developed an expressed desire to enter religious life as a lay brother, a goal he framed through his persistent engagement with instruction. Whether the intent reflected transformation or strategy remained uncertain. Life at Alcatraz continued to shape him through repetition and exposure. Day after day, he witnessed the same hardened men recounting their grievances, asserting their claimed innocence, or framing themselves as victims of law enforcement. These narratives circulated constantly inside the cell blocks, reinforcing perspectives that challenged the legitimacy of the institutions governing them. Johnson absorbed these stories, merging them with his own history of arrests, convictions, and conflicts with officers. The environment did not rehabilitate him. Instead, it fed a growing hostility toward law enforcement, particularly the federal agents he believed had mistreated inmates across the system. Over 9 years, the accumulation of those influences deepened into a hardened worldview. By 1953, when the parole board approved his conditional release, Johnson walked out of Alcatraz carrying nearly 2 decades of confinement behind him. The structured routines had disciplined his outward behavior, but they had also sharpened an internal pattern of resistance, distrust, and animosity. He left the island as a man who understood institutions intimately, who knew their processes and vulnerabilities, and who believed himself shaped by forces that had given him little reason to reintegrate. Those perspectives would drive him into a brief period of apparent stability, and then into a rapid descent that would draw national attention in the months ahead. Johnson's release from Alcatraz on March 20, 1953, placed him back into a world that had evolved during the 9 years he spent behind reinforced walls. The ferry transported him across the cold water toward San Francisco, carrying a man hardened by routine, shaped by resentment, and positioned at a crossroads between conditional freedom and inevitable supervision. His departure followed the standard procedures: final paperwork, a modest travel allowance, and instructions directing him to report to the Federal Probation Office in Los Angeles. The moment represented the completion of one institutional cycle, yet it also marked the beginning of another. The conditions of his release limited his movements, tied him to mandatory reporting, and forced him to reintegrate into a society he had abandoned long ago. When he reached Los Angeles on March 25th, Johnson proceeded through the legal requirements with an appearance of compliance. He registered as an ex-convict with local police and made contact with his assigned probation officer. His behavior in those early days indicated a controlled attempt at blending into civilian life. He reconnected with the former prison chaplain, who had once guided him through religious instruction on Alcatraz, and he approached Sid Hughes, an assistant city editor at the Los Angeles Mirror. Johnson's interactions with these men created the outward impression of someone seeking structure or assistance. But those efforts also provided him access to individuals who could help him navigate obstacles, such as securing identification, transportation, or employment. Hughes, moved by Johnson's account of past difficulties, helped him obtain a driver's permit and allowed him to use a company vehicle while preparing for his test. Through this association, Johnson secured a job at a heater company in Huntington Park, giving him a legitimate work routine for the first time in years. For nearly 3 months, records show no indication of criminal activity. He registered again with the Huntington Park Police Department as required, maintained steady employment, and avoided the type of conduct that had previously drawn attention. Those close to his situation saw these actions as signs that he had embraced the opportunity to start again, but the stability was superficial. Beneath it, old patterns remained active, waiting for circumstances that aligned with his ingrained instincts. His behavior during this period reflected the discipline he had practiced on Alcatraz: controlled, consistent, and outwardly compliant. Yet the shift from the rigid structure of the island to the unstructured environment of civilian life placed him in a position he had never successfully managed: long-term autonomy. Without the constraints of prison schedules or direct oversight, he faced choices that tested whether nearly 2 decades of incarceration had altered his path. The first months suggested progress, but the lack of internal change soon became evident. His encounters with law enforcement had taught him procedure, not reform, and his resentment toward those institutions maintained its hold over him. As spring turned into summer, subtle movements signaled the beginning of his return to criminal behavior. His routine remained intact on the surface, but he engaged with individuals who offered access to vehicles, information, and environments where oversight was minimal. The temporary quiet that marked his early months of release created a deceptive calm, an illusion of reintegration that would collapse abruptly. By July, he would step back into criminal activity with a decision that revealed how little distance he had traveled from the mindset he carried out of Alcatraz. The next phase of his life would unfold rapidly, drawing him deeper into conflict and positioning him on a trajectory that would end in a violent confrontation only months later. By mid-July 1953, the facade Johnson had maintained since his release began to fracture. He had settled into the rhythms of civilian life just enough to avoid suspicion, but the patterns that had shaped his earlier years resurfaced. The first clear indication came on July 19, when he entered a Los Angeles County supermarket posing as a police officer. He identified himself to the manager by name and department, portraying himself as a member of the chain store robbery detail. In that role, he asked for specific information about the store's security routines, bank deposits, and financial movements. His questions were precise and deliberate, reflecting an intent consistent with scouting a target rather than enforcing the law. The manager, recognizing inconsistencies in his conduct, discreetly observed him leave the parking lot in a red convertible and recorded the vehicle's license plate. Sheriff's deputies traced the car to a Huntington Park resident who had recently purchased it but had not yet obtained a driver's license. The owner told investigators that he had been lending the convertible to several acquaintances, among them John Elgin Johnson. When the supermarket manager reviewed a set of photographs provided by authorities, he identified Johnson as the imposter who had appeared days earlier. The discovery positioned Johnson as a suspect in a developing pattern of criminal impersonation, and investigators began assembling the timeline of his actions. The red convertible, once a casual convenience between acquaintances, now tied him directly to a deceptive reconnaissance, likely intended to precede a robbery. The situation escalated dramatically on August 4. That evening, Lieutenant Kenyon Kendrick of the Huntington Park Police Department responded to a call from a local landlord reporting a disturbing scene inside one of his rental units. There, in the bottom of a stall shower, lay the body of the convertible's owner. The victim had been strangled with a necktie, the knot tied with deliberate precision. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle beyond the violence of the killing itself, suggesting the victim had allowed his attacker inside. The absence of ransacked belongings pointed away from a burglary and toward a targeted act. As Kendrick and his team began their investigation, witnesses quickly connected Johnson to the victim. The landlord reported seeing the two men together on August 1, describing a brief interaction that indicated familiarity. Another couple recalled the victim in his yard with several men on August 2, one of whom was notably tall. When shown Johnson's photograph, the landlord immediately recognized him as the man who had been with the victim shortly before his death. Investigators concluded that Johnson had been one of the last people to see the victim alive, and his disappearance following the murder intensified suspicions that he was responsible. The evidence placed Johnson at the intersection of impersonation, deception, and homicide. His 3 months of apparent stability collapsed into a sequence of events that revived his pattern of escalating violence. His absence from his workplace, sudden severing of local ties, and disappearance from Los Angeles indicated a deliberate attempt to evade detection. The killing transitioned him from a parole violator into a fugitive wanted for murder, setting the stage for a multi-state pursuit that would draw federal attention and result in one of the most intense manhunts of 1953. Once Johnson fled Los Angeles after the August 4 murder, he moved with the speed and unpredictability that had characterized his earlier transitions between states. His departure left investigators with no traceable direction, only the vehicle of his past associations and the pattern of movement he had relied upon for years. The Huntington Park Police Department expanded its search, but Johnson stayed ahead by crossing state lines and adopting identities that concealed him long enough to avoid immediate detection. Letters later uncovered revealed his first confirmed location, contact with Arthur Dawson, an inmate in the Missouri State Penitentiary, and one of the 2 men who had attempted to escape Leavenworth with him years earlier. Dawson received a letter postmarked July 30, originating from a fictitious name Johnson used to disguise his correspondence. The message signaled continued loyalty to the criminal connections he had maintained throughout his incarceration. By late August, Dawson received another letter, this time from a sender using the name Frank Gifford, with a Florida return address. The content disclosed that Johnson had contacted him recently and enclosed a $50 money order. Investigators traced the address and discovered it belonged to Johnson's parents. The correspondence confirmed that Johnson maintained ties with his past, relied on old alliances, and sought support through the same network that had enabled his earlier escape attempt. These findings reached the FBI, prompting the United States Board of Parole to issue a warrant on August 10, charging Johnson with multiple parole violations, including the homicide. The FBI initiated a coordinated search, connecting field offices across several states in anticipation of Johnson's shifting movements. The next significant lead emerged on September 22, when Johnson's father informed agents that his son had visited the family home in Florida just days earlier. The visit was brief and unannounced. Johnson stayed long enough to speak privately with his parents before abruptly leaving on September 21, stating he intended to travel north and eventually return to Los Angeles. His departure occurred only one day before agents arrived, leaving investigators one step behind. The visit demonstrated that Johnson felt pressure closing in, yet remained unwilling to surrender. His parents offered no indication of his next destination, and the search widened again as agents attempted to anticipate his route. Reports arriving through FBI channels indicated that Johnson had been in Chicago around mid-August, living under the alias John Everhart. Witnesses recalled a man boasting about his release from Alcatraz and displaying a .38 pistol, further revealing his volatile state. He reportedly reacted to the sound of an elevator by drawing his weapon and stepping into the hallway prepared for confrontation. The accounts portrayed a man who believed capture was imminent and who would not submit without violence. His movements through the Midwest suggested a continuous pattern: short stays under false names, sudden departures when he sensed scrutiny, and a reliance on intimidation to maintain control of his surroundings. By late September, Johnson had moved east, traveling into areas where anonymity was easier to maintain. He carried cash, false identification, and the same hostility that had defined his years inside federal institutions. The cumulative reports formed a portrait of a fugitive propelled by instinct, rather than planning, relying on speed, distance, and the belief that no law enforcement officer would take him alive. His actions narrowed the gap between flight and confrontation, pushing him toward the final sequence of events that would unfold in Baltimore and bring the pursuit to a violent end. By late September 1953, Johnson's movements brought him to Baltimore, a city large enough to hide and yet small enough for a single mistake to close the gap between him and the federal agents searching for him. His path into the city followed the pattern he had maintained for weeks: brief stays under false names, careful avoidance of fixed routines, and an instinctive readiness for violence. He arrived with money, a weapon, and a growing awareness that the law was tightening around him. What he lacked was stability. His choices were driven by impulse, and on September 25, he reached for a familiar contact: Sid Hughes, the Los Angeles journalist who had assisted him months earlier. The decision to call Hughes revealed a complex mix of desperation and calculation. Johnson sought information about whether he was wanted in California, hoping to measure the danger before taking his next step. The call reached Hughes at approximately 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. Hughes, startled by the sudden contact, immediately notified the Los Angeles FBI office. Agents established an open line between the newspaper and their headquarters, turning the conversation into a narrow corridor through which they hoped to trace the fugitive. Johnson had promised to call back an hour later, and that window initiated a full mobilization. The FBI field office in Baltimore received immediate notification, and agents swept through the downtown streets, searching for payphones that could connect to Los Angeles. The information was limited. Johnson was using a public phone somewhere in the city, and he was armed. As the clock neared the appointed time, units were dispatched to theaters, bus stations, hotels, and any location likely to house public telephones. When Johnson delayed the return call until 3:55 p.m., the search intensified further. The second call lasted far longer than the first. Johnson spoke continuously, unaware that every minute he remained on the line increased the chances of agents closing in. In Los Angeles, Hughes maintained the conversation while agents monitored every shift in tone or pause, interpreting them as clues to Johnson's location. In Baltimore, agents tracked reports from switchboard operators and telephone technicians, piecing together fragments of information that finally pointed toward the Towne Theatre, a busy movie house screening a crime film that had drawn a large afternoon audience. The mezzanine, where the public phones were located, was nearly empty. 4 agents converged on the theater. They entered quietly, instructed staff, and moved toward the mezzanine stairways in coordinated pairs. The environment was dim, filled with the muffled soundtrack of the film below. On the upper level, the glow of a single booth light revealed a lone figure inside the phone stall. Johnson remained focused on the conversation, unaware of the approaching footsteps. The agents positioned themselves at both entry points, preparing to intercept before he could react. As they stepped forward, Johnson sensed movement and turned. His hand moved quickly to the .38 pistol he carried. The first shots came from inside the booth, striking Special Agent J. Brady Murphy and another agent in rapid succession. The remaining agents returned fire instantly. Bullets shattered the booth's glass panels, tearing into the narrow space where Johnson stood. The confined environment magnified the violence of the exchange. Within seconds, Johnson collapsed, injured multiple times. The phone receiver hung loose, swinging against the metal cord while the line went dead in Los Angeles. In that moment, the long pursuit of Elgin Johnson ended, and the final confrontation set the stage for the closing chapter of a case defined by flight, violence, and the relentless efforts of federal law enforcement. The final moments inside the Towne Theatre ended the pursuit of Elgin Johnson, but the aftermath extended far beyond the broken phone booth and the dim mezzanine where the confrontation unfolded. Emergency crews moved quickly through the narrow corridors, retrieving the wounded agents and Johnson's body while the film continued playing downstairs, its audience unaware of the violence occurring only a floor above. Johnson was transported to a nearby hospital, but the extent of his injuries left no possibility of survival. He had been struck 7 times, stomach, head, chest, shoulder, and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. His weapon, the .38 pistol he had displayed in Chicago weeks earlier, remained clutched loosely in his hand until medical staff removed it. Special Agent J. Brady Murphy, gravely wounded by the opening shots, was taken into surgery. He had been struck in the abdomen, and the damage was immediately recognized as life-threatening. His fellow agent, shot in the hip, was stabilized quickly, but Murphy's condition deteriorated despite medical intervention. He understood the severity as he was transferred toward the operating room, aware that the confrontation he had entered would likely cost him his life. His death marked the end of a career shaped by dedication to federal service and placed his name among the ranks of agents who had fallen in the line of duty. The FBI formally recorded his sacrifice, adding him to the agency's honored memorials. While the city processed the events of that night, FBI offices across multiple states closed their active files on Johnson. The pursuit had stretched from California to Iowa, through the Midwest, down to Florida, and ultimately to Maryland. Field reports, correspondence, and investigative summaries were collected and archived, forming a record of a man who had moved through the criminal justice system for nearly 2 decades. Each document reflected the same trajectory: early offenses, escalating violence, institutional resistance, and eventual flight. His death ended the manhunt, but it also underscored the volatility of individuals shaped by prolonged confinement and repeated confrontations with law enforcement. Authorities in Los Angeles prepared to reopen the homicide investigation linked to the strangled victim found in Huntington Park. Johnson's death provided closure in one sense, eliminating the possibility of trial, but it also left unanswered questions regarding motive, sequence, and the precise circumstances of the killing. The case transitioned from an active search to a final review, with investigators re-examining evidence and witness statements to document the most accurate reconstruction of events possible. No further suspects emerged. The pattern of behavior, timeline, and proximity confirmed Johnson as the sole perpetrator. Back in California, the probation office completed its formal assessment of Johnson's parole violations, detailing the violations that had triggered the warrant he chose to ignore. His brief period of employment, the registrations he filed, and the outward signs of compliance were contrasted with the impersonation, theft, and murder that occurred in rapid succession afterward. The contrast illustrated the instability of his reintegration attempt and the speed at which he returned to criminal conduct once opportunity presented itself. Johnson's parents, who had seen him only days before his death, received the final notification through official channels. Their home in Florida had been his last point of refuge before he continued north. The visit had been brief and uncertain, marked by the tension of a man who understood that authorities were closing in. The weight of the news closed the final chapter of a relationship marked by long absences, scattered communication, and the perpetual distance created by his repeated incarcerations. In Baltimore, The Towne Theatre resumed its operations after the immediate investigation concluded. The broken glass was cleared, the booth repaired, and the mezzanine reopened. Yet the space where Johnson made his final stand remained part of federal history, a location where a long pursuit reached its irreversible end. The case of John Elgin Johnson became one of the many entries in the FBI's chronicles of fugitives, whose paths led them directly into violent confrontation, shaped by years of resistance and decisions that left no possibility of surrender.